we have our four possibilities of cause of existence that we've covered. So in review, those are illusion, the universe is self-created, the universe was created by a self-existent being, and that the universe itself is self-existent. So if you'll remember, we covered illusion a couple weeks ago. We were able to mostly disprove that through the use of Descartes with I think, therefore I am, and we had all the fun with that. Then we, last week, looked at self-creation, and we looked at how that's a contradiction in of itself, because you can't be created. Something had to be there to create. It violates the law of non-contradiction if it's creation, right? So that brings us that something had to be self-existent. So, is it rational for something to be self-existent? That's kind of our first question we're going to wrestle with here. Because when we unpack this, self-existent sounds very similar to self-created. But when we really look at the difference, while we don't have a category because we exist within creation for something that exists that isn't created, it's not actually a contradiction in of itself, right? So logically, it's not a contradiction to be self-existent. So self-existent isn't unreasonable, but does something need to be self-existent? It's possible, but is it necessary? So a self-existent being would exist in itself, meaning that it has the power to be in and of itself. It doesn't need anything from outside itself to exist. It's not dependent on anything because it's self-existent in its nature. That also means that there was never a time that this being did not exist. Otherwise, it would be created. So, as we are looking at is it necessary for this self-existent being to exist? First, we're gonna look at two types of necessity for this. The first is a rational necessity, and the second is an ontological necessity. So, with the rational necessity first, if something exists now, so we've agreed that something exists now, right? It's not all an illusion. We dealt with that. So we agree something exists now. So if something exists now, something always had to exist. They're not the same somethings necessarily, but that second something has to have the power of being in itself. If there was ever a time when there was nothing, then we wouldn't be able to have something. That's what we wrestled with the self-created, right? Nothing can't something can't be created out of nothing. There was something there before. A being or something had to be there. You can't get nothing out of nothing. Or nothing. You can only get nothing out of nothing. You can't get something out of nothing. Right? So, for existence to be rationally, there has to have been something that is self-existent. Ontologically, we can look at this. So, as a review, ontology is the study of being, right? So this is the nature and what things are in what they are, right? Here we're going to say God doesn't exist merely because reason says he has to exist, right? We're not just reasoning out because of our rational discussion before. The God exists only because that argument says he has to. But he exists eternally because he has the power of being in himself, a way that his being cannot not be, right? So to be self-existent would require in that being to not be able to not be. A lot of bees strung together.
As long as it's not followed by a mouse, we're okay.
Right, exactly. Hopefully we'll avoid that one. And with that which is self-existent, eternal being, has to be changeless. Because it's never losing power or gaining anything in the scope of its being. This builds into the our God is an unchanging God, right? He doesn't need anything from his creation. It doesn't add anything to who God is, and it doesn't take away. So it's not like God took part of himself to make creation and lessened himself by it. So God is unchanging, and that's what's necessary in this kind of abstract self-existent being that we're talking about. As we get to this, so we've kind of looked at this self-existent being as being the creator, right? Well, a lot of probably the more popular theory right now that people will hold, in contrary to the idea of this self-existent being or any type of deity, would be, what if the universe itself is self-existent, right? What if it's always just been? This is really where the Big Bang theory comes from. It's this idea that in the past there existed a singularity, and that singularity had to have existed eternally before. And then somewhere between roughly 15 to 18 billion years ago, it's a long time, this singularity that's existed eternally past suddenly exploded. And everything that we know of today came into existence through this explosion of this singularity. So with that, all matter, mass, energy, everything that has ever and will ever exist had to exist in this singularity. And that with that explosion, everything is moving from organized to disorganized. With that, it brings up the interesting point. That means that it was organized, right, in the singularity. A question to ask of anyone who brings this idea forth would be, why did the singularity explode? What was the cause that made this change, right? We know from our basic high school physics classes that objects in motion tend to stay in motion, and objects at rest tend to stay at rest unless acted upon by another force. So this singularity was at rest, right? It was perfectly organized, everything in an infinite speck. So what acted upon this to make it explode into everything that we see now? A lot of times you'll get, well, we don't know. Well, that doesn't really seem to me, if you're arguing this as a valid, rational explanation for why everything exists, we don't know, doesn't seem like you actually are coming up with an answer. And we see that anything we find in the universe as part of creation is changing constantly. It's degrading, it's getting old. As we noted before, it's moving from organized to disorganized according to this theory, right? What they will argue in regards to that is that what the universe is made of is what is eternal, not necessarily the objects and the matter that we see, but the very the elements and even below the elements, the subatomic particles are what was always there. Right?
Is that like the building blocks
Yeah, it's kind of like the super small building blocks. Like it gets beyond atoms to
So
even
that's
small.
eternal, not necessarily the planets and all that stuff is what they would say.
Right.
Okay. Makes sense.
Yes, stardust, if you will. This self-existing something is not transcendent at all, but rather it's ultimately immanent. It is everywhere. So it would this self-existent portion would either be a part or a sum of the universe in this case. And we actually at some level can affirm that depending on how we choose to define universe. It's a bit of a loaded word, right? If we mean everything that exists, then yes, God is immanent with the universe. He's part of the universe because God exists. If you mean everything in the created universe, then no, God is outside of creation. And when we say outside or transcendence, we're not referring to a location, which is easy to think of when we say outside, right? Like it's easy to think when you say outside the universe, you have the universe here, right? So we have the universe. There we go. There's the universe, and then we say, oh well, the self-existent being God is outside the universe. Well, that's not what we mean by outside the universe. We mean this again. We're gonna throw out an expensive word again with ontologically, that God is outside the universe. He is of a different level of being than the created universe that he is over. So he can be completely immanent and transcendent at the same time, because it's in his nature that he is transcendent, and he can be immanent within that creation of his own. If they try to say, well, if we start talking about the matter and these building blocks, and we really start unraveling it, it gets to often the idea of some sort of pure energy, some sort often referred to as like a pulsating pure energy from which everything is generated. That's kind of the source of it all in this idea. It's this abstract energy and matter at the central. But that would be something that is, again, ontologically different than the rest of the universe, right? We're this pure matter energy that was self-existent is ontologically different than the created universe that came from it. So at this point, we're actually saying the same thing, they're just not willing to admit it. As we start unraveling this, they're saying that this is called X, this unknown idea of the origin of this self-existent being. Now being's probably a little bit loaded of a term, which might be a place where we would get some objection here, because most people, when they think of being, they think of a rational being, or a life form, and that's not what I'm saying we agree on. This would be something that has the power of existence in and of itself. That's what we agree upon. So our version of this is a living, willful being. Theirs is just something that exists and doesn't necessarily have a will, but we're ultimately agreeing that there is some being and that the universe itself is not self-existent. This would, and we just disagree on what to call this and the nature of this being, right? This is where, in this argument, and this kind of chain of arguments, you'll get some opposition of making this type of an argument from other Christians, right? Because you're at this point we are arguing for general theism, and they're not wrong in saying that. The key is that we need to make the connection from this general theism that we're making the case for to the God of the Bible. If we fail to make that connection, then we've lost, right? Like, but thus far, we're building, and this is kind of the principle of classical apologetics, and in that you build the philosophy or the philosophical case and the rational case for a deity that meets all these characteristics, and then we show how the only rational choice for that deity is the God of the Bible and Jesus Christ, right? I think this also speaks to, as I was reading through this and wrestling with the material a bit, I think I came to the realization that part of what I've seen anyway with some of the objection that I've seen towards classical apologetics versus like a presuppositional approach depends somewhat on the goal of the apologetics that you're undertaking. I find that the classical apologetic is very good for defense of your faith, to show that it is reasoned. It's not the best evangelical tool, right? Like, we're not going to... You may present through a classical apologetic and convince someone of the truth so far that they then look into it. But ultimately, the gospel is the evangelical tool. So if you're not... So the presuppositional approach would start with the gospel in the Bible, presupposing that as truth, and then arguing the other direction. So I think it's a better tool for an evangelical tool, where if someone is saying, why do you even believe what you believe? That doesn't make sense. Then classical apologetics can defend your faith. So it's kind of a bit of a difference in the goal.
When they work together, though, somewhat, it sounds like, I mean, one could start with the classical as a basis and over time maybe work into the presuppositional.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it depends on the particular conversation, right? So I think knowing both as thoroughly as you can, and not saddling yourself into a particular type of argument because that's what I do, prepares you to be able to put forth the best defense or case for what you believe. Because if you're presented a case, and I've heard of classical apologetics doing this very, very often, right? People who get so into classical apologetics, and they'll be trying to present the gospel, but instead of presenting the gospel, they'll start all the way back at the case for a deity at all, right? Like, this is an opportunity to present the gospel. You don't need to go through all that. They're not asking for those answers. There may be a time as you're working through, like, okay, this is what I presented. You believe, okay, well, now let's work through discipleship and those things. There may be a time to address these questions in that case, right? But not getting yourself so far down the road of, I'm a classical apologetics that I have to use this method of presentation every time I want to talk about the necessity of the existence of God.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
Because, and I think this is one of the things that we've come to a lot as I've been working through this book and preparing, is a lot of the arguments presented in this book and these philosophies that we've discussed aren't necessarily the exact philosophy and argument that you're going to hear from people. But a lot of these philosophies that are covered have been impactful on our current society, and there are undertones from them, right? Like, I think this is especially true. Probably the most practical one is probably the Big Bang, as far as what we've covered so far. But even just these ideas of like self-creation, right? Like, I would say that a lot of people would hold self-creation if you don't talk through it. Or they would merge the self-creation and the Big Bang together, and that they probably hold some idea that's
Chance.
somewhere. The chance idea, like, oh well, and this is part of why the Big Bang theory has to have such a long timeline, right?
Yeah.
Because it then incorporates random chance. The only way they can try to explain the way things get to a particular way is that it has to have chance involved, right? Like random mutations, things like that. Even once you get past the original break from inorganic to organic, right? From non-living to living. Even once you jump that hurdle, which is one that I have never seen successfully jumped, even once you get past that, in order to get to highly evolved life forms, as they would call it, the amount of time that random mutation has to occur, because mutations happen really extremely slowly, so that we can see this within populations, right? Like new characteristics and things like that occur really slowly unless you're doing specific breeding for a particular trait, right? Like if it's a guided breeding program, like within livestock or animal or other things, you can get to a trait you want fairly quickly by selective breeding. But for that to be a random mutation, and for that mutation not only to occur, but to be advantageous, and advantageous to the point that it provides a benefit within the ability to reproduce, requires such a long time frame that's why we have to stretch out our view of the age of the universe so long in order for this unguided hand to be, or this process to work out. I think
it still doesn't account for the design.
No, it doesn't. I think one of the best illustrations I've heard of that is if we all sat around the edge of this room and we all had a pencil and we're going to throw it into the middle of the room. How many times are we going to have to do that for them to stack one on top of each other, making an X all the way up, right? Like, could it happen? I guess it's possible, but like, what is the probability of it happening would be so astronomical that it wouldn't, right? Like, and that's what we come to when you really look at the unguided, like self-existent universe, is in order for things to have occurred to get to where we are, the random chances are so astronomically ridiculous that the only way they can try to explain it is throw that timeline out, 20 billion years, and
keep adding.
Yeah, and then keep adding, right? Every time we come up with something new, right?
Is that like trial and error almost? Is that what they're getting at? Kind of like a natural form of that? Like it tries this and, well, this mutation isn't advantageous and it doesn't get to...
Yeah. So within evolution, it's not even a trial, because the view isn't that the mutation itself was intentional. The mutation is accidental. Whether or not it's advantageous, and it has to not only be advantageous, and this is where they really lose me, is like most mutations would start off small, and then if they were advantageous, slowly be added to and exemplified, right, by that idea of selective breeding, right? Because that's what they really point to in evolution and a natural selection process, is that something happens and one of your kids happens to have some advantage over kids. It's random chance. There was a random genetic mutation.
Bell had 2 thumbs.
Right. Bell has 2 thumbs on one hand, and somehow that's an advantage. In the current, and here's the one that I find the biggest stretch, is it's not only advantage as we see it play out eventually, it's immediately an advantage. So that person has a reproductive advantage, meaning that they're more sought after. So generally, these advantages would occur in males, right? Because women are reproductively limited, right? So in order for a trait to be a random mutation and it be extremely advantageous, not only does it have to happen, it probably has to happen in a male, or by chance it happens in a female, and then one of her male offspring acquires that random, which also isn't guaranteed, right? Because you get genetic material from both parents. So one of her male offspring would have to have acquired this advantageous mutation, and then be able to procreate, and then their offspring would be more successful than other offspring, and that's how a mutation makes its way through to become something new. Now, not only does that have to happen in, say, one aspect, right? It has to happen enough to not only slightly shape a species, which we do see happen, right? Like this is where like the microevolution that we see that happens within breeds and even within isolated populations of the same species, we'll see slight variances. So we do see that happen, but it has to happen enough and enough times that we actually get something different.
The old goes away.
Yeah.
And that's the reason evolution, Darwin's theory, that we still have apes.
Right.
And eventually there would never be any more apes.
And it has to be significant enough that even if the populations were isolated, so with the idea of apes, so say they weren't in direct competition, and the populations got isolated, and the apes are here, and our ancestors are here in another location, and they're not directly competing anymore because of their isolated locations. These changes have to happen enough that we're no longer just subspecies even, but actually different species that can no longer procreate across each other. Like that's where the idea gets really ridiculous, and you have to draw out the timeline. So far, is this jump to being what we classify as a different species is really significant.
So much for a perfect God.
I mean, where do you take that thing? That's insane.
Well, it requires so much time in order to even try to make the argument, and even then, the argument, when you really unpack it, is absurd.
Yeah.
And that's not even dealing with how long does it take a rock to become alive, right? Like it was one thing when Darwin and we didn't know how complex cells were, and he's making the case that, okay, well, there was basically a warm pond, and we don't understand how complex even just evolving a single cell organism would be to that first stage, and he's taking it from a single cell organism on, because he thinks that jump from a warm pond to a single cell organism, because it seems like in a warm pond these things just kind of exist. Because if you've ever had a fish tank and you don't put anything in it and you put water in it, it starts growing algae, right? So like if you didn't understand how complex that algae was actually in itself, you might think that this isn't that big of a jump. But with the more we discover and the more we learn about how complex living organisms actually are, the more ridiculous this idea that this occurred by chance over a really long period of time gets.
So that's where we see science and theology converging instead of diverging.
Right, yeah. The more we learn, the more you actually have to realize that your concepts, you're willfully choosing your path of what you believe, right? When they say, well, this is a scientific view, well, no, because it's historical and it's based off of so historical science versus observational science are different, right? So when we're doing historical science, this actually fits really well with Dino Dave that came the other night. But when we're doing historical science, we're making guesses based off of what we see now and experiments we can do now going into the future, and we're trying to apply that along with our assumptions backwards to try to see what we think happened in the past. The problem is those assumptions, right? So, and the fact that we don't want to admit what those assumptions are as a culture. We don't want to admit the weight of the assumption that a scientist is carrying in when they assume that God doesn't exist. They are then automatically eliminating that as a possibility, and therefore they only look at the things that meet the assumption of God not existing when they're making their historical guess backwards, because they've eliminated all of this as a possibility. So now they're only going to look at this narrow. Well, that means in order for this to happen, we need billions of years, because we see mutations happen going forward. Okay, well, if mutations happen going forward, and there's no God that created the universe the way it is, and so we don't have that as an explanation, and now we want to look backwards. How could we get the species that we have now? Well, without this being guided or created and these things being specifically what they're supposed to be, well, the only way you can do that is this has to be really old. And then we take that assumption of this really old and we apply it to other things. And they just keep building upon themselves with the same base assumption that there isn't a God or there is a God. So depending on which one of those you choose when you're making your first base projections backwards, that's how you build the rest of that. I think this is where
basically when you eliminate a possibility, you're forced to come to that and somehow arrive at a reason, a logical reason.
Yeah. So they have to try to make an argument because they've already eliminated in their thought process. They've eliminated God so early on in their thought process that they actually can't even imagine backtracking to that. So, let alone even seeing that that's an option. And so then they will regard anyone who does as being ridiculous, right? Like
anti-science.
Right. When it isn't. It's just we start with a different assumption about the universe when we start our science.
And you mentioned something about the universe. In their view, the universe is degrading, like it's going towards less ordered. I mean, seriously, what a contrast to the Christian view of the universe, like that is, right? Where we're pointing towards like a defined end that is actually perfection and not complete. Is it complete disorder that they think of, or what are they?
Yeah, so everything will eventually spread out and basically break down, right? So,
That's hopeful.
There's a lot of joy in that worldview.
there is, and the funny thing is that within their thought, this is one of the biggest problems to overcoming the where did life come from, right? Things don't go from less complex to more complex in this view. They degrade.
Man, that's good.
Any other thoughts, questions?
What a mess. Praise God that we're... Yeah, I mean, seriously, you think about something like that, like what Pastor Lena just preached today. I mean, I know it's not exactly apologetics, but I mean, as a result, like, we have joy, we have hope, and you look at, these other explanations of creation, and it's like, man, no wonder people step into that realm of God and define themselves and all of this mess that actually does lead, what's odd is, right, that leads to destruction and horribleness, and it's almost ironic that that's where that leads, and yet that's where their idea of creation and such points to. He's almost, not a sense of humor, like in that, but there's some irony, definitely. That's interesting. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I think it ultimately comes down to a worldview issue, right? And I think this is where Christians have really failed in the later part of the previous century, was that we ceded ground on things that are actually really important to worldview. We decided that we weren't going to argue for literal Genesis, right? Like we were gonna back away from that. Well, while that might work for one generation, you lose that basis, right? When you back away to the idea of I would say even intelligent design, right? Like we're going to compromise and we're going to say, okay, well we'll teach intelligent design because that leaves room for God. Well, that's a compromise, and because it doesn't insist on God, it shifts the worldview to a softer spot, which then allows this other worldview to come in. Like, people don't realize how much these little but kind of base level ideas shape worldview, and worldview is so important in how we perceive everything and how things play out.
Genesis 1-3 is absolutely, positively a must for the Christian faith. It has to have been. If that's an allegory, we're done. We're done. I mean, seriously, if that is an allegory, if there was not an Adam in the garden with a real sin, with a real fall, what's the gospel? Right. The gospel is founded upon that, almost.
Well, like the issue with guided evolution, right? Like I remember when I was a kid hearing the case for, well, God exists and evolution is a tool he used through creation. Well, the problem with that is that evolution is a tool of death and suffering. The way evolution works is through suffering, pain, and death to shape the next generation. So if you don't have the fall, how do you take up the case, or even if you were to say God used evolution to get to a literal Adam and Eve, and then they sinned, you then have to explain the suffering and death before the fall.
Yes. Amen. And that's why it's a disaster. Theologically, it's a disaster if Genesis 1-3 is taken as an allegory and not as history. That's factual. Yeah, I mean, how do you? I don't know how you can recover historical, true biblical Christianity without it.
Well, I don't think you can, and I think that's where we get to people believing that your religious faith is a blind faith. It's a jump. I believe it because I believe it. I don't have anything to back it up. That's why we get there, is we've killed our own arguments and really even our own logical basis for being able to walk through these things like we're talking about, because we've eroded the truth that underlying some of these basic things in our worldview, to the point that we can't make the logical case. We're standing on soft ground trying to lift something, right? Like, it doesn't work very well.
What was that? There was something, but where you could have a theological truth that was scientifically false, and a scientific truth that was theologically false, at the same time, and people were like okay with that. I can't remember in what section it was in, but it was, it breaks that non-contradiction, whole thing, and it's just, but yet, because of our softness on like Genesis 1-3, how many contemporary Christians somewhat, maybe not, harshly, but somewhat live that out, right? Where they will believe in evolution, and I mean that's like their thing, and yet they try and do Christianity. And is that a part of why, as Pastor Lehman said, we're not as joyful? Maybe not us in this room, but like as a people, we're not as joyful. We're not representing God, the way that we should and could, because of compromise on these things, and we don't realize like how impactful that is.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that builds into a lot of attitudes about even learning within the faith, right? Like, how many churches could you go to in America today where you're not going to be encouraged to learn? It's about the feeling that you have during worship and your response to that feeling. Not that there's anything wrong with feeling and what God gives you, but there's also the truth and the learning and the theological side of it. It's all part of what God gives us, right?
Yes. True joy, the lasting happiness that Pastor Lehman came from a proper understanding, right? And without that, it's ephemeral. It's here today, gone tomorrow. Yeah. That's not good.
People don't believe in an absolute truth. Whether it's absolute, whatever you believe is good for you, whatever I believe is good for me, but if you go around and you continue to do that, if everybody's right because you haven't identified a truth, an absolute, to begin with. The Bible provides the absolute.
Yeah.
But in a lot of places, we're not even willing to have that conversation. And like, we're not even willing within Christianity, let alone when we go out into culture, to be like, to challenge someone on that. Be like, no, that can't be true.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it seems as being harsh and maybe not winsome to say, no, you're not a woman. You're a man. Right? Like, even something that basic that is so obvious that you can see. Right? We're afraid to just say it because we don't want to offend someone. We've allowed our niceness to make us into victims of and wimps of bullying, right? Like, if you say that, someone might call you a bigot, and for such a long time, that was a legitimate criticism that you should avoid because you didn't want to be one of those people. And we've tried so hard to avoid that, and we've been taught so long that that is the worst possible sin you could commit, is to be prejudiced. That the mere accusation of it, whether it's founded or not, is strong enough to make you back down. Instead of even defending your point of, no, I am not that. Here's what I'm actually saying. But we're so scared of that label because we've been taught it's the worst thing you could possibly be that we back down.
The thing that boggles my mind is everything is so like we can't defend it by science. But they just use science however they want. I mean, it's scientific unless it's wanting to be called a law instead of infant. You have to throw science out.
Yeah, no, and I think that's another tool that's been leveraged against us is a misunderstanding of what it is science means. It is science as a process. It's a process of questioning. It is not a list of facts. Now there are scientific laws that have so much evidence on them that they're fact and they're basis. But most of what is science is here is our best guess given this current framework and what we've observed. This is our best guess to what's happening. And it's educated, and there's a process to making those guesses. Like it's not just a random guess.
But then they defend it.
Yeah. So that's the problem is that scientific laws and ideas that are formed through a scientific process, but they haven't lived up to the scrutiny of a scientific law, are defended on the same basis unless you are also a scientist working through the scientific process. You're not allowed to challenge this idea other than through this process. And most of us don't have the time or the academic library to work through a scientific process to try to get published in a journal to oppose an idea, right? And things that aren't even science, like you were saying, that this is just a blob of cells. Well, really it's that they can't define life because they don't have an actual belief. And they're not willing to completely throw out that there is something about human life that is special, right? Like, this is the one that I think probably gets me the most, is instead of like fully embracing their idea and being like, it doesn't matter. It's just it's a person, but what's that matter? What is a person? It doesn't matter, right? They say, well, it's not a person yet, or it can't feel pain yet, or it doesn't respond as if somehow that demeans the quality of that life, or that it is a life. They want to lessen the value of this life or that life because then they can dispose of it.
Minimize the impact.
But really, their worldview doesn't hold anything sacred about life. There's no reason, from an atheistic perspective, to oppose abortion whatsoever.
But if you shoot a pregnant mother and that unborn child dies, you get charged with 2 murders.
But from an atheistic worldview,
They don't think either one ought to be charged.
right, well, yeah, if you're going to be logically consistent, the most you can say in that is that we have laws that exist to keep society together. That's the but there isn't actually anything morally wrong with murder. It's only because, well, if we allow murder, then society pulls apart. That's the only ground for this law.
Whether there's a moral response.
One of these philosopher dudes said that's why he believed in God. Not because he believed in God, but because it was necessary for society. That there was, from a moral standpoint, that there was a moral being. And he wasn't a Christian, or maybe, I don't know. Yeah. I would say he wasn't a Christian if you're believing that way, but he did. He rationalized himself away from believing in God, but for the sake of society.
I think that's where Jordan Peterson is currently anyway, right? He believes that there is moral truth and there's allegory. I think he gets in his own way of believing that it's actually true, but he says he behaves as if there's a God, whether there is or isn't. Right, so, well, anyway, I think we ran over. I thought we were wrapping a little bit early.